In 1991, the rock star was a god. Stadiums and spandex, perfect hair, Guns N' Roses selling out arenas, Michael Jackson sitting on top of the charts, rich, untouchable, larger than life. Then, in January 1992, something almost unthinkable happened. A scruffy little record by a band from a rainy logging town knocked the king of pop himself off the #1 spot in America. And the entire glossy world that came before it began to die. It wasn't killed by a bigger, richer rock star. It was killed by a handful of broke misfits who hated everything rock had become, who dressed like they'd given up, and who, more than anything, never actually wanted to win. This is how grunge became grunge. Grunge wasn't really a genre. It was a small group of friends and rivals, crammed into the same gray, rainy corner of the Pacific Northwest, making music that sounded like the weather, heavy, slow, and overcast. And in just a few short years, that tiny local scene rewrote what mainstream music looked like, sounded like, and dressed like, before collapsing almost as fast as it rose. Today, we trace the whole arc, where it came from, where the word itself came from, the misfits who built it, how they turned pure alienation into an identity, how thrift store flannel ended up on Paris runways, and how grunge's single core belief that selling out was the worst sin imaginable both defined it and destroyed it. So how does a scene this allergic to fame end up conquering the world? To understand grunge, you first have to understand where it didn't come from. It didn't come from Los Angeles, and it didn't come from a record label boardroom in New York. It came from boredom, rain, and distance. Aberdeen, Washington, in the late 1970s, was a fading logging town about 2 hours from Seattle. Gray skies most of the year, not much work, and even less to do. It was the kind of place a certain kind of kid grows up desperate to escape. And for those bored, alienated teenagers, that emptiness left an enormous amount of room to do one thing: get completely obsessed with records. Grunge, at its root, is what happens when talented, frustrated kids in a dead-end town have nothing to do but absorb music and stew. Because grunge didn't appear from nowhere. It was stitched together from 3 older threads. The first was garage rock and punk, 1960s and 70s bands built on lo-fi noise, simple chords, and raw distortion. Detroit's The Stooges pushed that to its extreme, and their frontman Iggy Pop, who hurled himself off stages with no regard for his own body, became a blueprint for how a grunge singer should behave. The second thread was heavy. In Birmingham, England, Black Sabbath had spent the early 1970s inventing a down-tuned, sludgy, doom-laden metal that would echo straight into Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. And the third was closer to home: Neil Young, whose sprawling, feedback-drenched guitar work earned him the nickname the Godfather of Grunge, proof that raw noise and American songwriting could live in the same song. But ingredients aren't a meal. What actually turned these scattered influences into a scene was something far less glamorous than genius. It was isolation. As far as the music industry was concerned, Seattle was a dead zone, too far from Los Angeles, too far from New York, too cold and rainy to bother scouting. No major label was looking, no radio programmer was listening, and that neglect turned out to be the single most important thing that ever happened to the music. Because when nobody is watching, nobody is telling you what will sell. Seattle bands weren't chasing the radio because the radio wasn't interested in them anyway. They played for each other, in the same few clubs, borrowing gear and trading members, until the same small pool of people had marinated in the same sound long enough to make something genuinely new. And poverty shaped the sound itself. This was music made cheap. Cheap guitars, cheap amplifiers pushed until they broke up into distortion. Songs recorded fast on small budgets in modest studios. That murky, sludgy, heavy production that became grunge's sonic signature wasn't purely an artistic decision. It was, in large part, simply what heavy music sounds like when it's made without money. The limitation became the aesthetic. The grime was the budget. Keep that in mind, because it's the same story you'll hear when we get to the clothes. Over and over, grunge took what it couldn't afford to change and turned it into a badge of honor. By the middle of the 1980s, all the pieces were in place: the influences, the isolation, the poverty. What the scene didn't have yet was a name, or anyone outside Seattle who cared. So, where does the word grunge actually come from? And here's the honest answer up front. Nobody fully agrees. Like most of the best origin stories, this one is a tangle of competing claims, and anyone who tells you it's completely settled is selling something. What we do know is that grunge as an ordinary English word is old, and it's unglamorous. For most of the 20th century, it simply meant grime, dirt, muck, something filthy. To call music grungy was at first an insult. It meant the recording sounded dirty, murky, badly made. Sit with that, because it's a pattern you'll see in almost every episode of this channel. Scenes are very often named by their enemies. The label starts as a sneer, and the scene picks it up, wears it with pride, and turns the insult into a flag. The most repeated version of the story credits Mark Yarm, later the frontman of Mudhoney, who, before his bands were famous, wrote to a Seattle zine mockingly describing his own music as pure grunge. Whether that's truly the first use or just the most quoted one is genuinely disputed. The word was drifting around the underground, and pinning it on one person is probably a myth we repeat because a clean story is satisfying. What's not disputed is who turned grunge from a stray insult into a marketing category the whole world would learn. And that's a story with names, a record label, and a deliberate plan. Whatever you want to call it, the people who built this thing were a specific, strange, and brilliant cast of characters. Let's meet them. Every scene needs its architects, and grunge's most important ones barely picked up an instrument. Enter Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman, who in 1986 turned a fanzine into a Seattle record label called Sub Pop. Sub Pop mattered less for any single band than for an idea that this specific, unglamorous local sound was a movement worth branding. They marketed the grit deliberately. They took that old insult, grunge, and made it a category. They even flew a British journalist out to Seattle to write the scene up, essentially manufacturing the myth in real time, selling the world on grunge as a place and an attitude before most of America had heard a note. Think about how strange that is. A scene defined by its hatred of hype had, at its very center, one of the cleverest hype machines in music history. That contradiction is baked into grunge from the very first day. Enter Mark Yarm and Mudhoney. If you want the sound of early grunge at its most pure, sneering, fuzzed-out, snotty garage punk noise, Mudhoney is the answer. They were arguably the most influential band of the early scene precisely because they never chased the mainstream. Mudhoney never got rich, never went stadium huge, never softened their edges for radio. What they did was set the template and the attitude that everyone around them looked up to. They were the beating heart of the scene before the world was watching, the band the other bands wanted to impress. In a story that's about to fill up with global superstars, it matters to plant this flag early. The people who defined grunge's spirit were often not the people who got famous from it. Enter Chris Cornell and Soundgarden, the opposite pole of the scene entirely. Where Mudhoney was scrappy garage bluster, Soundgarden was Black Sabbath heavy doom, slow and crushing and enormous, fronted by a singer with the range and raw power of a classic rock god. Put Mudhoney and Soundgarden side by side, and they barely sound like the same genre, and that's the whole point. Grunge was never one sound. There was no single grunge riff or grunge tempo. What tied these wildly different bands together wasn't sonic, it was a zip code and a shared attitude. They came from the same rainy city, played the same clubs, shared the same suspicion of everything polished and fake. Grunge was less a genre than a postcode with a chip on its shoulder. And then, of course, enter the Misfits from Aberdeen. A withdrawn, artistic, deeply troubled kid named Kurt Cobain. A tall, funny, restless bassist named Krist Novoselic. And eventually, after a long parade of drummers, a ferociously powerful one named Dave Grohl. They called themselves Nirvana. But here I have to slow down and be honest, because the myth gets very heavy right here. Kurt Cobain has been sanded into a saint and a symbol so many times that the actual human being disappears underneath. He was a gifted, troubled young man, not a prophet who set out to lead a generation. He said over and over that he didn't want that job. He loved the Beatles as much as he loved punk. He wrote genuine pop songs. He was privately ambitious, even while the scene's code demanded he pretend not to be. And here's the detail that tells you everything. Around the time that record climbed to #1, the moment we opened this video with, Cobain was reportedly so broke he'd been living in a car. The man who supposedly killed the rock star barely had a roof over his head. Hold on to that gap between the fragile person and the giant symbol, because it becomes the whole tragedy later. So what actually held this together, if it wasn't a single sound? A feeling. And that feeling was alienation. This was a generation, soon to be labeled Generation X, coming of age into a flat economy and deeply cynical about the polished, money-drenched rock of the 1980s. The hair metal all over MTV was pure fantasy. Fast cars, willing women, endless parties, everyone winning. To a broke kid in a rainy town with no prospects, that fantasy didn't just feel unrealistic, it felt like a lie, and an insulting one. Grunge sang the opposite. Where hair metal sang about triumph, grunge sang about not being okay, about depression, boredom, self-doubt, alienation. And a staggering number of young people quietly realized they recognized themselves far more in the second story than the first. Out of that came the identity's first and highest commandment: authenticity above everything. You did not show off. You did not chase fame. You did not admit you'd practiced, or, God forbid, that you wanted any of this. Virtuosity was suspicious. Sincerity was sacred. The flashy guitar solo, the entire currency of 80s rock, became almost embarrassing overnight. A whole scene organized itself around the belief that trying too hard, or wanting success too openly, made you a fraud. And a look and a behavior came bundled with it. You slouched, you mumbled, you stared at your shoes, you treated the trappings of stardom, the limos, the posing, the spectacle, with open contempt, even after you could afford them. Asked to clean up for television, the instinct was to do the exact opposite and make the executives sweat. And for a huge number of people, that was the whole appeal. Grunge was a sanctuary for anyone who never fit the shiny mold. You didn't need the right clothes, the right money, or the right face. You needed to mean it. Belonging came from being real, not from being cool. And in a culture that had spent a decade selling aspiration, that was a radical, almost spiritual permission to stop pretending. Here's the crucial part. That permission was portable. A kid in Ohio or Manchester or Tokyo who had never been within 1,000 miles of Seattle could put on the record, pull on a flannel shirt, and belong, because the entry fee was never geography or wealth. It was a feeling. And that portability is exactly what let a tiny, local, anti-commercial scene detonate into a global identity almost overnight. Which sets up the trap the whole scene was about to walk into. A subculture whose highest value is not wanting to be famous has no idea what to do when it becomes the most famous thing on earth. Now the clothes, because grunge is one of the clearest examples in all of music history of a look that began as the opposite of fashion and became high fashion anyway. Here's what most people miss. Grunge style wasn't a style at all. Flannel shirts, ripped jeans, band tees, worn Converse, thrift store cardigans, long johns under shorts. None of it was a statement. It was just what was cheap, warm, and available in a cold, broke corner of Washington. Flannel is what you wear when it rains 200 days a year and you can't afford a new coat. The look was the ideology made physical. Anti-glamour, anti-effort, anti-money. It was visible proof that you weren't trying, which, in a scene where trying was the cardinal sin, made it the perfect uniform. Which is exactly why what happened next is so strange and so revealing about how the mainstream digests a subculture. In 1992, the designer Marc Jacobs, then at Perry Ellis, sent an entire grunge-inspired collection down the high-fashion runway, flannel and floppy, layered silhouettes, but reinterpreted in silk and cashmere and priced like luxury goods. The most defiantly anti-fashion look in music had become fashion's hottest idea. The collection was so controversial inside the label that it reportedly contributed to Jacobs being let go, even as it became one of the most talked about fashion moments of the entire decade. The clothes that meant "I have given up" were now walking a Paris runway with a 4-figure price tag. And the actual musicians? Baffled and a little disgusted. When Jacobs sent the samples up to Seattle, Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love reportedly burned them. Love confirmed it years later. "We were punkers," she said. "We didn't like that kind of thing." The scene experienced its own commodification as a kind of theft and answered it with a bonfire. Because this is the paradox at the heart of any authentic subculture the mainstream falls in love with. The instant the clothes hit the runway, the meaning inverted. What said "I don't care" now cost hundreds of dollars and took real effort to assemble. And the entire point had been that you couldn't buy your way in. By the mid-90s, you could walk into a shopping mall in any American suburb and buy pre-ripped, pre-faded flannel, mass-produced rebellion folded neatly on a shelf and marked up for the privilege. Fashion magazines ran grunge editorials. The scene had completely lost control of its own image, and there was nothing anyone in Seattle could do about it. And notice the pattern, because it's one of the core stories this whole channel exists to tell. A subculture invents a look to signal that it stands outside the mainstream. The mainstream, hungry for an authenticity it cannot manufacture on its own, reaches in and takes the look, while quietly leaving the values behind. The flannel gets copied. The anger doesn't. What's left is an empty costume, and the original scene is left standing there wondering who it even is now that its uniform belongs to everyone. The clothes were only the surface. Grunge's deeper mark was on how an entire generation talked, thought, and carried itself. Start with language. Grunge helped shove a word into the center of American culture: slacker. A word for a generation that looked at the greed is good 1980s and seemed to opt out entirely. The mumbled, exhausted vocals, the deliberately unkempt everything, the refusal to smile for the camera. It all sold a posture of studied indifference. Whatever stopped being just a word and became a philosophy, a verbal shrug aimed at a culture that had demanded relentless enthusiasm. Adults genuinely panicked about it. Magazines ran cover stories trying to decode these apathetic young people. And the scene knew exactly how clueless the media was, so it played a joke. When the New York Times called Sub Pop looking for a glossary of authentic grunge speak, a receptionist named Megan Jasper made up every single word on the spot. Swinging on the flippity flop, harsh realm, cob knobbler. The Times printed the whole fabricated list as real slang. It was the perfect prank. A scene watching the mainstream try so desperately to package it that it would print pure nonsense as long as the nonsense sounded authentically disaffected. The apathy was partly real and partly a pose, but either way, grunge had handed it a soundtrack and had a good laugh at everyone rushing to bottle it. Then the ideology, and here grunge did something genuinely unusual for a mainstream rock movement. Many of its biggest figures actively turned their platforms against the values that normally travel with rock stardom. Kurt Cobain was loudly supportive of LGBTQ rights and feminism, and openly hostile to the macho, sexist posturing that had defined mainstream rock for decades. He'd even use his own album liner notes to tell racists and homophobes, in blunt terms, not to buy his records. Pearl Jam waged a years-long self-sabotaging war against Ticketmaster over service fees, effectively giving up their own ability to tour on principle. This wasn't just an aesthetic of grime. It was an active rejection of rock's traditional swagger, excess, and cruelty, a rock movement that seemed almost embarrassed by the idea of being rock stars. And it permanently reset the emotional register of what mainstream music was allowed to be. Before grunge, for a huge rock act, admitting weakness was close to career suicide. The job was to project power. Grunge made vulnerability, depression, and open alienation acceptable subjects for the biggest bands on the planet, and kicked open a door that late 90s alternative, 2000s emo and a whole generation of confessional artists would walk straight through. That permission to sound unwell, to admit in public that you were struggling, may be grunge's single most lasting gift to the culture. But that same gift had a shadow, and we are not going to look away from it. Because that same creed of total authenticity, the refusal to perform, the deep discomfort with fame, the compulsion to be real at any cost, collided with real, untreated pain, and, for several central figures, with genuine addiction. Grunge's honesty about despair was one of its gifts to the world. It was also, for some of the people who made it, inseparable from the despair itself. The scene couldn't cleanly separate its art from its wounds, because its whole creed insisted the two were the same thing. Kurt Cobain died in 1994 at 27. Lane Staley of Alice in Chains, and years later Chris Cornell and Scott Weiland from the scene's wider orbit, would also be lost. A movement built on refusing to fake anything paid a heavy human price for that refusal, and it does everyone involved a disservice to romanticize it. The music was extraordinary. The losses were not poetry. They were people. So what's left? Almost everything, honestly. The sound never really went away. You can hear grunge's DNA in post-grunge radio rock, in 90s alternative, in every quiet verse, loud chorus song that followed in Nirvana's wake. You can hear its emotional honesty echoing through emo and through a whole generation of artists who were finally told it was allowed to sound like you felt bad. And the flannel came back too, of course. It always comes back, sometimes as nostalgia, sometimes on a runway, sometimes just as a warm shirt on a cold day. Grunge is woven so deep into the culture now that most people wearing its uniform have no idea they are wearing a scene's surrender. Remember where we started. In 1991, the rock star was a god, all stadiums, spandex, and perfect hair. Grunge killed that god, not with a bigger, richer rock star, but by proving for one strange and brief moment that millions of people were starving for something that did not try to sell them anything at all. And here's the final, brutal irony. A subculture whose one unbreakable rule was, do not sell out, had no map for a world that suddenly wanted to buy every last piece of it. The fragile people at the center of it were left holding a fame they had genuinely never wanted. A man with the #1 album in America and barely a place to live. That was grunge, heavy, gray, honest, and gone almost as fast as it arrived. Like a song that fades out before you are ready. If you made it all the way here, you are exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And tell me in the comments, which grunge band did I leave out that deserved its own chapter? I read them all. Get down there and make your case. Next time on Tape Hiss, we leave the rain behind and go back to 1976, to the year punk detonated in 2 cities at once, the scene that taught grunge how to not care in the first place. Until then, keep listening to the hiss.